Welcome to Exceptional Circumstances for Exceptional Learners. My name is Rebecca Muller, and I am so looking forward to this conversation tonight. It's been one that I've been meaning to have for a long time, and one that has been blocked in many of my professional endeavors. And not blocked intentionally, but I think blocked because people just don't know how to have the conversation. So that is why we are bringing in some experts here tonight. We will be talking about race and special education and how to have the conversations that we're not having. And so we have Kimberly Milton here from Restore More, who I was able to connect with through the lovely platform of Instagram. And they have amazing things on there that are really highlighting some of the things that need to be done. So welcome. I'm so excited to have you here tonight. I apologize for my sniffles. I'm going to do the best that I can, but there was no canceling this conversation tonight. So thank you. Um, so why don't you introduce a little bit about who you are and what Restore More is and how people can connect with you, and then we'll get into the good stuff. Whoops, can't quite hear you, Kimberly.
Here we go.
There it is.
Yes, all the Zooms. I was going to say, or I was saying first, thank you, Rebecca, for creating the space to be able to have this critical conversation. As you said, it is often not easy, but tough conversations typically aren't. But through that, we grow and we are able to come to some understandings and new learning. So thank you again for creating this space. As Rebecca said, I'm Kimberly Milton, and with Claudine Miles, we are the co-founders of Restore More. We have over 30 years of experience in Title I schools and have held various seats within the education sector, from teacher and school leader to board member. And in 2018, we created Restore More to help organizations build capacity with restorative practices, anti-racism, and social emotional health. And we create curriculum and workshops for teachers, leaders, and parents. Something we're proud of is that our services impact our community and larger market by sharing wellness strategies and offering, like I said, training and curriculum for teachers and principals, and of course, workshops for parents to provide them with tools of how to unpack that tough stuff that life brings. And this year has been no exception to what that is and what it looks like, and also to how to approach their work with a restorative and anti-racist lens. Our solution impacts our community because it makes the work for principals easier by equipping their staff with new tools and skills. And in addition, parents are impacted because they too will gain new skills and tools to add to their parenting tool belt. And finally, students are impacted by the skills their parents and teachers gain. As a result, BIPOC students have less trauma surrounding school experiences, suffer less learning loss, and have lower suspension rates. So if you are at a school or know a school that could potentially use services like ours, please reach out to us. We can be found at werestoremore.com. I'll drop it into the chat. And on that page, you can find a lot of information. Some accomplishments that we are extremely proud of is that we have worked with Atlanta Public Schools to enact policies and around trauma-informed and restorative practices that impact over 56,000 students. So we are super proud about that. And additionally, in the last 2.5 years, we've been able to serve about 38 clients and 28 partners. And we love the individuals that we are working with, and overwhelmingly, they're indicating that they are likely to implement the strategies that we share, even though they're hard. And over 98% of them state that they would definitely recommend our sessions to their colleagues. So that's a little bit about us and the work we do. And
I just love the fact that it's not a professional development where you're going to come in, you're just going to get some information, you're in, you're out, and you just expect the people to get it.
no,
About the entire community. And that's so
yeah.
important to have the parents, to have the
Hmm.
students, the teachers, everybody has to be a part of it so that the language when you're speaking about things is at least the same, so that
Exactly.
those hard conversations, no matter what happens within a community, I think that's real and really the big ideal around restorative practice
Hmm.
is that it's about the community and it's about the coming together and about taking it to that next step where it's not a punitive measure.
Yes.
um, and I can think of things that have happened this year alone where people just don't know how to respond, and it's not an administrative issue because the parents have expectations of what administrators should do
Hmm.
or should not do,
Hmm.
and then everybody has their own opinion, and so if you're not talking the same way, it
Right.
it's difficult to get to that next step. So I love just the, I guess, the philosophy behind what you're doing.
Thank you.
So yeah, so we have I guess, what has been some of the biggest change within the districts that you're working with?
Um, as far as changes that we've seen, or
Yeah,
changes after working or during work, or just from like our general experience.
anything that comes to mind that can kind of shed light as to why this work is so important.
Absolutely. So I would definitely say that within the pandemic, or once that happened, and individuals were, I would say, more in a space of like we were all collectively quarantine, so to speak. So a lot of what we were seeing and noticing and had to grapple with, was all happening to us in our varying levels and our varying spaces. And not only, the pandemic of COVID, but, the pandemic of racism was extremely highlighted within that season. And I think more eyeballs were able to digest the information and really began to process that, whoa, there's something really wrong here. Like, this is not a group of individuals just saying something. We can collectively see that there are inequities that are in place. And I think where our work came into play, a lot of individuals, a lot of schools wanted to, one, know how to make sure that their people are well, make sure that their kiddos are well, make sure that the parents are well. Wellness became, one, a buzzword, but second, a truth. Grace became like the other word of that we needed to begin to show one another, because in the Zoom world, you get to be in people's homes. You get to see like who they are as individuals, and the kids running behind you, or a dog like running across the street. It really began to humanize people, whether, we like the Zoom world or not. And then people began, as they were seeing racism like play out on the big screen, which was great, wondering like, okay, what can I do? How can I help? How can it, reevaluating their systems, their practices that they were having within their schools, and wondering, what is that anti-racist discipline that we need to make sure that we're having at our schools to ensure that our community of BIPOC students, BIPOC staff are safe? Because what individuals were noticing or really feeling is that some of the spaces that have been created do not necessarily feel safe or were built to be safe for BIPOC community. And when I say BIPOC, just, for language sake, is Black and Indigenous people of color. So anyone who falls within that category. So I think when people started to see it play out on TV and the screen, and then people were recognizing even the inequities of how the solutions of the pandemic were affecting people, like COVID were affecting people of color versus other communities, people really began to look deeper of like, how can we have the conversation? It's definitely a conversation we have to have. People are in a space where they need to be healed. But there may be people who haven't been equipped to have that conversation, but eagerly want to have that conversation. So I would say that for us, we were getting a lot of schools or organizations were like, how can we be better? And that was the first step. How can you, one, help us check to see if we're doing all that we can? And how can we continue to be better to ensure that not only our whole community, but specifically our BIPOC community can feel that this is a safe environment for them to work, live, and prosper in? Hope that answers the question.
Yes, absolutely. And I know for me personally, it was the Baltimore riots in 2016 was
Mm-hmm.
like, there's something we're not and doing enough of. And back here, I have all of the books that I have acquired over the course of the last 6, 7, 8, 12 years, right?
Right.
And each of them comes at a different time. But I think the one for me that I had to start to really to recognize was what it meant to be white. We don't talk about what it means to be white and how that affects the others, right? And
Mm-hmm.
that's something that there was a lot of things that and started to come out, and that we need to have those conversations, and it's
Mm-hmm.
not just because we're seeing it. It's been there for a long time.
For a very long time.
And so this was another one, waking up white,
Mm-hmm.
and finding myself in the story of race. Just how, I don't want to say blind we were to some of the things about, the next one that comes to mind, hot read last year, The Color of Law,
Mm-hmm.
and what that means, and the red line lining, and how we're talking
Yes.
about these schools don't have enough funds. Well, why? That was done systematically. Like, that was put into place. Even the some of the men and women who fought in the war, if they were black or white, got different, um the loans were completely different for
Absolutely.
school, for housing, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, like, these are things that we didn't have to think about, and
Mm-hmm.
it wasn't polite to bring up. And that's all. Like, at this point, I would hope that that is now uncovered.
Mm-hmm.
But I know, like, I can read and be aware. Once I know and better, I need to do better. But
Right.
it doesn't allow me to understand what the black experience is, and
Mm-hmm.
to really understand.
It's
Um,
interesting, and when you said that, what really resonated with me is that because of those systems that were in place, then a segment of the population was able to start to begin to have generational wealth. And for some that may seem like a small thing. So like, okay, the loans were different. Well, the loans affects you being able to live within a certain house or to be able to gain a house to potentially get the job that you want. And like I said, a segment of the population was able to start to garner generational wealth, which maybe began in the early 1900s or after the war, that other BIPOC populations didn't have access to. So you have generations now that are in essence trying to catch up. Um, but sometimes that message is like falls flat. Like I hear the adage of, just pull yourselves up by your bootstraps. But like if I don't have any straps in my boots, like and I just got boots, like I'm running with my boots, but I ain't got no straps. So it doesn't necessarily compare. And yes, um, what also often happens is that now, another book I know that you probably have behind you is White Fragility.
Yes,
That's
it's on
another
the
good book to like, because as a person within the BIPOC community, sometimes we definitely don't want to necessarily be the individuals that are always teaching, always like, well, this is how you do what you do. But and to your point, it's like starting and giving yourself the education first, knowing and hearing what it is, and then being able and open to have the conversations of what the impact of it is. And then once understanding and being empathetic to the impact that these systems have, then helping to be an ally and an advocate for communities so that some of these systems can begin to be broken down, because it's not an individual, it's not even a group of individuals. There are deep rooted systems that are in place that almost in some ways prevent individuals from being able to receive or to have access to equal or equitable resources.
Absolutely. And I would love to get back to the idea about white fragility in the Q and A. There's just so much to be said about this topic, but I really wanted to bring it back to why is this important to talk about race and special education
Woof.
and the intersectionality of that. And I bring that up because it's been a personal um, observation.
Hmm.
I know I started my career in a suburb of Washington D.C. and it
Hmm.
was very much the haves and the have-nots, and that was what and people said. We had a large Hispanic population, 77% with English as a second language. And but for the most part, the staff was very mixed. It was very we had a good representation
Yeah.
of what the students look like and the staff.
Hmm.
And in some ways, I was very fortunate to have that experience because one of my dear friends, Rika, she's incredible. She's and getting her PhD right now in University of San Diego and doing amazing things. But
Beautiful.
she was able to talk to me in an honest way, call me out on
Mm.
the things that I was doing that I didn't even realize. And one of the things that she said to me that just stuck was, when have you ever had to look for a band aid that was the color of your skin? And I was like, well, they're band aid color. She goes, and what color is a band aid? And I never thought about that, right? Because I didn't have to. And the conversations we used to have and during lunch and talking about the kids and really and seeing what we could do to empower them
Hmm.
completely changed my outlook from how I grew up in white suburbia in New Jersey. I didn't know better. So once you know and better, you have to do better. And when
Hmm.
I came back to Jersey, first thing I noticed as I'm walking around the middle school that I was working in was it basically looked segregated. The special ed
Mm,
kids, the behavior kids were on one side of the school and looked a certain way, and the honors kids looked a different way. And it made me start to think, and that's when I was like, "Oh, I'm going to do my master's thesis on the disproportionality. This sounds like something to investigate." And my professor at the time said, "If you do this, you're risking your job."
mm,
And I didn't get it. I really didn't get it. Rose
right.
colored glasses. Call it what you will. But it started me on the path to start and bringing up, different texts and to see what I could do.
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm,
you still can't get the full experience, and I see it within special ed a lot. That sometimes I'm like, I don't think this kid needs to be in special ed. They're SLD, so it's specific, which is the least specific one.
right.
And I'm thinking about the whole picture, and I'm just not and getting it. And
Right.
then you get into the kids that actually need more support. They
Mm-hmm.
don't want to give them more support because then their numbers are going to look
Mm-hmm.
poorly. And I'm talking very broad, not specific to a district or a school, but I know that that is what happens. So can you talk a little bit more about like what that is and how we can try to at least find a way to support the kids?
Right. I mean, what you said brought up a few points for me. Like, as we were speaking earlier, there are just systems in place already. Redlining is a known one. Just, I mean, school to prison pipeline is something that people speak of often. But when it comes to special education, I mean, it would be no surprise that an overwhelming majority of children of color, throughout the United States. And this is interesting because you just mentioned this article in Washington Post, but I was doing a little research for tonight, and it was like a large amount or a large majority of students of color attend schools that are largely made up of students of color. And the quality of their school experience seems to be affected by the intersection of issues of race, culture, language, and disability. And I know we all probably know these numbers. Research has shown that 3/4 of African American, more than 3/4 of Latino children attend majority student of schools of color. And that doesn't necessarily sound like an alarming thing, but when you think about where the largest population of these individuals are and where they actually reside, that then speaks to the financing they receive, the resources that they receive, and that there is then this idea of what we were mentioning before, that there are private schools and that there are potentially for-profit charter schools, where there could potentially be like this white flight. Like, I'm not going to send my kid to the city school. I'm not going to send my kid to this public school. I'm going to send them off to this private school. I'm going to send them off to, this one. And that article in Washington Post was highlighting a school district in North Carolina that was initially a private school, but then got documentation, whatever funding to be able to switch to a charter school, which now gets federal funding, because that's what charter schools, they typically get some sort of federal funding. Um, but the system of charter school, I would say, wasn't set up for that reason. I myself even went to a school in my youth where there were two schools in my small town. I'm from Indianola, Mississippi. There's Indianola Academy, and then there's Gentry High School. Go Rams. And I loved my public school. I love my public school experience, but there were no white students in my school. Why? Because all the white students in my town went to Indianola Academy. What was Indianola Academy? A place you had to pay tuition for, which was outside of the medium income of most of the average families in that city who were mostly Black. So then there is the literal railroad that then separates us, where all the white children go to this school and all the Black children go to this school. And to date, no one has necessarily done anything to change that dynamic. And I know that my small town is not the only small town or even city that experiences that. So I would say that resonates with me. And then two, when we think about identifying special education students, typically students of color are identified, like you said, with those categories that are um, more like OBD or have like ADHD. They're never not necessarily
Behavior,
yeah, it's normally like a behavior disability, an emotional disability, which may very well be true. However, they are less likely to be identified as dyslexic, which some may equate as like, um, some may say is like the rich man's disability. They don't necessarily are students of color don't aren't necessarily labeled as being on the spectrum or being dyslexic. It's typically the go-to is LBD, OBD, behavior disorder, and like you said, it's low-hanging fruit. It's easy. Whereas some of the systems in place as a school aren't necessarily culturally responsive for how kids of color may learn, and that might be the first step. The system itself of school was set up to like function in a very specific way. I mean, when you think about how school was started before, it was started in a way to produce these individuals who could work in these industries. And back in the day, it was like factories and education and these like specific categories. And it was set up in a very specific way that may not cater to the learning style of BIPOC students. The system itself hasn't changed. There have been some schools that have tried to integrate different learning methods, but that is too also a part of it. Some of the curriculum doesn't speak to the experiences of BIPOC individuals. Like I said, the learning styles, the outcomes that are asked of students may not necessarily aligned. And when I say that, they aren't necessarily as culturally responsive. It's like BIPOC students have to fit themselves into a space, and if they don't exactly fit into that space, you may potentially now be labeled. Whereas some strategies, some deeper testing, um, some different resources from the beginning could really alter the trajectory of the students.
but that even goes into, some of the things related to healthcare and
Absolutely.
where people are going to get their health care needs done. So when they have the kids in the early years, they're getting identified later if there is a problem.
Hmm.
And that is all within the system. I wanted to point out a quote because this is from Despite the Best Intentions by Lewis and Diamond. I believe it's 2014, so it's been around for a bit.
Hmm.
Um, but what is often overlooked is that the collective and institutionalized character um, ren- renders itself particularly invisible to the people that benefit.
Mm.
When a relationship is regularized and institutionalized, it
Hmm.
simply becomes a case of say la vie. That if there's no reason to have a personal in insight, if it doesn't affect you, you won't go the extra mile. I can say the same thing about mental health. If you've never felt what it is to be anxious,
Hmm.
it's really hard to help a kid who's having a panic attack because you cannot relate that experience.
Right.
So, what do we need to do to get that connection and
Hmm.
to understand. Nicole in the chat was saying, sometimes in special ed with the Black students, she's heard a colleague say, "I just don't know how to teach them."
Hmm.
Um, so, and that's specifically in reference to the Black students, not necessarily the white or the Asian students. So where does that come from? Where does
Mm.
that thought process? And at this time, I think I would love to hear from um, people who are here who would like to share. Uh,
Absolutely.
but before we do that, um, I just want to set some norms. I want everyone here to have the ability to discuss experiences openly without judgment, because if we need to have that space to support one another. The ability to explore tough discussions that perhaps you've always wanted to say but never had a safe place to do so, and to know that you are in a place of and people with experience who want to support you. And so, with that in mind, Bernadette, feel free to unmute. You can turn your camera on if you wish, and I will spotlight you for the crowd.
Sure. Thank you. And thank you for having this wonderful forum. So yes, I did have some questions in regards to this topic, because as a mother, I had experienced, and my son had experienced, the teacher trying to human traffic him into special education on very, how can I say, very, the use of subversive tactics, as well as the reasoning was very subjective. So the question that I have is this: under the system of white supremacy racism, where the one of the main things, main features is promoting mental health issues like body dysmorphia, saying that the Black skin is evil and bad, and creating that isolation and exclusion, and creating that toxicity and harm, because that is definitely one of the particular areas, or the main area is white supremacy racism that causes this. And then you have children that are trying to figure themselves out. Their frontal lobe is not even developed. It doesn't develop until age 25. They're going through all this psychological abuse. So then they're being told that they're bad, they're ugly, they're worthless, under the white supremacy paradigm. And then in addition to all that abuse, when the child acts out, then they are punished, and then they are then human trafficked into special education under things like ADHD and other, and conduct disorders. It's not even actual learning disabilities. It's not actual. It's again very subjective. And then on top of that, it's not as if the academic progress is being taught, and there isn't any real measurement to ensure that the child is getting the assistance that they need, which is usually outside supports and the stop of racism. But the school gets to commodify off of all of this with more funding from the government. So I don't know. Like, to me, this looks like another avenue of human trafficking. How can this be stopped, and what measures can be put into place to monitor? And is it even possible to even take out of the public school system and actually put into the community their own school system, where it's for the benefit of the children? So for instance, if it's for a Black community, the Black community would design their own school, where there is a better understanding of the children, and that the children are not readily labeled, and the parents are not put, and the child is not put through any more abuse, because this is essentially what it is.
Wow, that was thank you for and bringing that up. I think, you know, I'm definitely going to defer to Kim's opinion here, but that trauma piece is so real, and that's what I
Yeah.
just kept hearing come up is that repetitive trauma.
Absolutely. I would say that one, we do recognize that there are a lot of systems in place. However, it is unfortunately then the burden of the parent to ensure that the systems and things that are supposed to be in place, the measures that are should be advocated for, the testing that needs to be done specifically, strategies that need to be put into place, and that those actual steps are being implemented. I was part of a school system, like I said, for almost 20 years, or no, like 16 years or so. And within that school system, I know that there are many levels of to identify what is the best learning styles or the best learning ways for children. It starts with like an RTI referral, which isn't something that automatically puts you into a special education program, but it really sits down to dig, are there different learning methods? Are there different learning strategies that this scholar needs to get in order to make sure that they thrive? And unfortunately, for a variety of reasons, some schools are either not equipped, they may have a blind eye to, they may not have the resources to, and then some don't necessarily have the pushback from parents to make sure that they're following through with the process, because some parents may not be informed about the process. I have a very close friend who is a former educator who had to stay on top of her school in order to make sure that her daughter was actively either identified, some strategies were put into place to see if that would be helpful, some small strategies be put in place. But she had to be relentless in following up with them because they were not necessarily following through with what needed to be done. And again, that is the unfortunate part, that you potentially as a parent have to put in that extra layer, and there may be times where schools don't necessarily inform parents as intently as they should about the processes that need to be put in place, and they skip it to this, well, if he's acting out or she's calling out and they're 6, then that doesn't necessarily mean that they have ADHD, they're 6. So it's also being able to have that open conversation. And then what I would say too about potentially having schools like that are maybe within communities, my only push within that, I'm not opposed to having school choices for individuals who want to have a different community feel. I will always push that in order to further the conversation, a level of diversity needs to be in place so that we as individuals can and feel comfortable with having these conversations with one another, because we are learning these experiences together. I think sometimes it's probably less of where the school is, but what the school is actually doing. And so that's why a lot of school districts, or some, are trying to put in this critical race theory, because then there is this level of understanding starting from when you're in elementary school of like, oh, that is wrong. I'm not going to treat my friend like that. Or my friend is different from me, and that's a good thing. But this is also how they see the world. And it just provides an open and better platform to be able to have that conversation. But Bernadette, I empathize with what you're saying, because I do hear and I have seen what you're speaking of. But I would say that unfortunately or fortunately, it's the burden of the parent or advocates. Because parents can also get outside advocates that can speak for their child within the system. Because again, no matter if it's a public school or private schools, there are levels to the process, and it begins with RTI. and it ends with like SST and then an IEP. It doesn't automatically say the kid is acting out and they get the IEP, but it really takes people holding schools and systems to the fire to make sure that the students are actually getting the resources and the number of hours of resources, the strategies of the resources that they're supposed to get.
And Kim, I thank
Yeah.
you so much for your answer. And I do understand where you're coming from. I had to advocate and fight really hard, bring in the superintendent
Yes.
and ask the credentials of the teacher for making that determination as to how she came to the evaluation of my son having ADHD.
Right.
Typically, there was no credential behind, and there was nothing to substantiate. But what I find as barriers are, number one, for the advocates to be utilized, oftentimes the advocates do not reflect the community, so they do not understand the nature of the situation with the people they are to be working with.
Mhm.
The other thing too, I just saw that comment. Yes, teachers cannot make the diagnosis, but they make it all the time. And I've had to even had to advocate on behalf of other parents who have gone through the same thing. They seem to be experts and wearing many hats, but no credentials. So that's why I always tell parents to challenge. But the other thing too that I've also noticed is that oftentimes the school, if they do not feel that the parent is aligning with the school, then somehow they will start blocking the parents from necessary information. And
Mm.
it could be basic things such as policies and procedures or access to resources or things of that nature. And then it's just another uphill battle. A lot of the parents don't have the expenses for those evaluations. So, I mean, that's also another thing too that is of concern. Where can they get the grants and the funding for those evaluations for their child? Often,
Mhm.
Black children are not even placed into the gifted program, and many Black children deserve to be in the gifted program, but the evaluations again are out of pocket. So, I mean, these are the unnecessary barriers based of white supremacy racism, and I just find it disgusting, and that's why I feel that sometimes the best place to do is to get out of that traumatic situation.
Absolutely.
Similar to, as you know, if a woman was being abused, we wouldn't be expecting her to try and work the system and get more people. You tell her, get out of the traumatic situation
Absolutely.
so that you can have some sense of clarity and then move from there, but to stay away from the toxicity.
Absolutely. And and that makes perfect sense. It's almost alarming to me to hear that there may be a school that makes parents pay that evaluation out of pocket, because there is funding that is supposed to go into the schools for them to do said evaluations, as well as I lost my other thought. You said something really good before. Oh, and that the teacher making the diagnosis, and it's like, no, and you're right, that the teacher can, and they may put this mental label on a kiddo, but it's a doctor that actually makes that final diagnosis. And as a teacher, my role in that is to fill out a documentation that chronicles what the students' behaviors that I've noticed. And for sure, it shouldn't be just one instructor. It should be a collection of instructors that kind of speak to the story of the kid. And I have friends that are working and dealing with this as well with their kiddos, of that we haven't been in school for a year, so to speak. So it's like, I can't get my teachers to potentially do an evaluation. I have to speak from my experience as a parent of what I'm seeing happening within my kiddo. And like you said, if that environment is toxic, you're absolutely right. It may not be the best fit. And that speaks to a larger system. And the remedy for that, just in my opinion, is that for schools to also begin to infuse anti-racist discipline in itself, because if there is this anti-racist discipline, then also infuses restorative practices, that also infuses social emotional learning. Teachers themselves are aware of their bias, because we all hold some biases. Um, we all do, but it's about recognizing what your biases are and how they are then projected out into the space, and understanding that you hold the key in how that interaction happens, one, and then being able to unpack what you have going on, as well as what may be triggering you, what triggers, what the school needs to unpack, what are the disciplinary systems that are in place. Do we only have like kid acts up, it goes to a referral, and then they get a suspension? Or is the kid misbehaves, we have like this process of having a conversation, we then try to get to the heart of it, we then have them come back to the class, we maybe have them try to repair the harm. There, for one is an anti-racist discipline, a restorative discipline practice, and the other is a more traditional discipline practices. And unfortunately, a lot of our BIPOC students get caught up in that traditional discipline pattern because they may just call out. But if there isn't necessarily a system that allows them to speak through why they're calling out, or what may have caused them to want to wiggle in their seat, and they have to just go to this punitive, yes, the BIPOC students will rack up the numbers way more because there aren't those interventions in place. So school systems as a whole probably really need to rework their disciplinary system to be more inclusive of how kids, as you said, the frontal lobe doesn't develop until 25, how kids behave actually by reframing what a mistake is. Um,
And also there is one more quick thing to add too.
mhm, mhm.
What I've also encountered, and what have other parents have also encountered, is that in some situations, there is nothing wrong with the child. The child does not have a behavior issue, but because the teacher is looking for some additional experience in special education, they've decided to go and create this fictitious label so that they can then say that they have an experience in that field so that they can utilize it to try and get into another position. So that's also something else that I've also noticed and other parents have noticed, and which I find is very disgusting and disturbing. But nothing seems to be done. Either the teacher union, seems to protect them. Other colleagues seem to protect them. When the parents go in and inquire further and investigate further as to why this is happening, because they have no substantiated proof behind it, the teacher can then go and cloak under the guise of, well, I was just acting concerned and in good faith, when really they were trying to use the child as a stepping stone to get into special education. So that's also another issue too.
I think that knowing the law and knowing what um, the the protocols are, that's a part of special ed that at least you can't argue with what is stated within the law, right? So it sounds like your particular case, if you definitely want to talk more about it, we, I don't know if we can create a space for that, but
So just to add that it's not my particular case. I've already gone through the experience. My son's already in post-secondary
okay.
education and he's getting his degree. So like that is not even an issue to me. And that's mainly because of my own parenting and rest and relying on the resources that I've had. But again, these are experiences. Sure, you can say that it's due to the law, but the law is only as good as the people who interpret them. Look at the amount of people that get off for shooting innocent people. Like it's, you know what I mean? So, I don't think that is a satisfactory answer. The fact is that nothing is being done regarding some of the teachers who do engage in this and who get caught because they are being protected by things like the union and other colleagues. So that's also another thing that needs to be looked into and taken very serious consideration, because really this is a human trafficking of Black children and other children of color into special education, where for the most part, they don't need it.
Um, and that was one of the other pieces that we wanted to explore tonight, because there's a lot of conflicting data, because we all know that at the end of the day, data can be skewed, but that is there an over representation or actually an under representation, excuse me. So like I think that's an interesting thing to be looked at, because I always assumed it was over, but the point is it's disproportionate. It's not equal to the amount of the students who should be getting the quality service versus those that need it and aren't, versus those that are. And I do think that just having the conversations, Nicole was saying, like, how do you let other educators explore what their and biases are, um and what does that look like? Because I think the conversations, they get started, but then they kind of stop when things get uncomfortable, or because I just feel for you, Bernadette, that had to be exhausting, and that was something that I know, Restore More really looked at, that self-care piece, because
Mhm.
it's all exhausting. And so at what point, like, you keep fighting and fighting, and the system doesn't allow it.
Right.
And so what can we do to make the awareness and then rise up, so that there aren't and parents who feel the way, um and Bernadette does, and then actually address the issues, because it is, I mean, you talked about discipline, that goes all the way, the pipeline to prison. Like, there is a big issue with um our privatized prisons.
And
That's, so it's all like interconnected and very messy.
mhm. And I just want to uplift, and I know we have about 3 minutes left. If Rebecca, if you can give me sharing capabilities, I have like a little graphic that I would love to share. But I wanted to speak to what Nicole also said of like, what tools can we offer educators that may help identify implicit biases when thinking about making recommendations? And one that we have incorporated into our work is the Harvard Implicit Bias Assessment, which is a very interesting assessment. I've taken this assessment a few times now, and my outcome is very different almost each time. It pretty much kind of falls under the same, but it helps us to be able to, one, have a conversation as a group. Another activity that we participated in is an identity wheel, where we each bring forth what our spots are within our identity, and just have an open conversation about that as well. And I know Rebecca wanted to make sure that we at least left this space with maybe some tangible to-dos of what individuals could begin to do to help um, with that idea of creating how to stop the bias or how to do it. So I do have a couple of suggestions that I would love to share in the space. One would be intergroup contact. So create and or join dialogue groups that are diverse and extends over a period of time. Many people may see this as like a book club, which we kind of talked about before, which is not a bad space to be in. It's a great start, but I would say it shouldn't be the only thing that you participate in. Another way is stereotype replacement. Recognize when you're having a stereotypic thought or when you observe stereotypic portrayals in society, and identify the factors behind that portrayal and replace the stereotype with a non-stereotypic response. I mean, I know I grew up in the age where sometimes those ideas were just commonplace. And I watch some movies now from the 80s and I kind of cringe. I'm like, oh, that was bad. That was really bad. And not even just racially, but sometimes gender. Sometimes like, that's problematic. That's not okay. So I then began to try to do replacements from my childhood of things that I saw that were okay. Revenge of the Nerds is my realizations of like I used to love that movie, but then I thought back and I was like, that wasn't good. So I had to replace like that idea or that thought behind it. Um, the next one is counter stereotypic imaging. So image in detail a person who counters a stereotype. Alternatively, consider using photos or images if you're an instructor to counter existing stereotypes within like your literature. I made it a point that I was going to find emojis that were like the color of the skin of my students. And I was very intentional about that, of like that reflected all of my students. And that was just a small detail that I brought because typical emojis were, they started out as the Homer Simpson orange, which is not reflective of the greater community. So things like that. Individuating refers to the process through which a person achieves a sense of individuality, separate from the identities of other, and begins to consciously exist as a human in the world. This is how BIPOC folk want to be seen. We don't necessarily want to be seen just as BIPOC individuals, but I'm a woman. This is a man. And men and women, they share a lot of the same um, responsibilities in this world. Perspective taking. Perspective taking is the act of perceiving a situation or understanding a concept from an alternative point of view, such as that of another individual. So some people say like that's putting yourself in that person's shoes. And sometimes you may not be able to do that. However, really begin to think like, why would that person think that or see that? So really trying to take in that perspective. Improve decision making, slowing down and removing discretion and ambiguity from decision making. Ask yourself, what evidence has supported every conclusion I have drawn about this? Or how can I challenge unsupported assumptions? There are some times where there may just be an assumption that comes up and you're like, well, that's just the way it is. But what is the evidence that supports that is the way it is?
If you're
And
gonna
then,
say it, you got to prove it. That's like
right.
yeah.
And then lastly, like name and understand privilege. Like privilege is not binary. And we're not talking about just as being white or black as being privileged, but we have it by class, age, educational status, ability, religion, sexual orientation. These are all privileges. And that doesn't mean it's bad, but clearly identifying the privileges that we hold and understand how it can lead to imbalances in equity is key. Ask yourself, how do others perceive my identities and intersectionalities? So I would say I would just want to make sure I leave you all with some of those ideas to help to begin to one, have the conversation and to stop that wheel that's turning of to be able to have the hard conversation.
Thank you so much.
Mhm.
I really appreciate you sharing that. And it's something that you just can't do once. And I think that's a really important thing too. It's something that you kind of have to always kind of go back to. It's a part of self actualization and becoming a human. Uh,
Mhm.
but I think that there's so much happening right now. You talked about how the critical race is
Theory.
something, yeah, the theory, and that they're trying to bring in, and there's states that are actually going against it now, and like
Hmm.
my brain wants to explode. And so unfortunately there is a lot of work to be done, and we do have to keep fighting, become an ally. Don't rely only on the BIPOC folks in your school to lead the mission, because
Hmm.
they're exhausted. um, but to work together.
Hmm.
And I know for me too, sometimes I don't know how much, am I taking up the right amount of space, or do I need to back up, and what does that look like? But the fact that I'm questioning that, I know that I'm at least on the path. I am not pure in any sense.
Hmm.
We all have thoughts, but by being a part of this and learning and read reading, at the end of the day you have to talk to the people who you're thinking about, right?
Right.
If I read all of these books but never sat down and had a conversation with a colleague, what am I doing it for?
Hmm.
And I think sometimes instead of approaching it, we make ourselves smaller, or we just ignore it, and that's I think that is what I see more commonly. It's hard, so let's just avoid it.
Yeah, and I would say as we, walk away from this space, if there is anything that I can just impart, that sorry if you can hear the dogs. I live near a
Okay.
dog park. I do apologize. Um, but if I can impart is that when you find yourself in any space, that you use your opportunity, your privilege, your now that you know information, that you use that as an opportunity also to speak up in the space as best you can, and your voice may quiver. Trust me, your voice may quiver, but your voice also has deep and meaningful power. So the more that we each speak up and the more that we each support, the more that we can see the changes that we want to happen. And if you're in a school, I know that a lot of schools have formed anti-racism committees to help review not only anti-racism practices within the school, but also how they can make the school feel more culturally relevant, more diverse. And if that's something that your school hasn't done, maybe you can be the leader of it and bringing in other folks, but really putting yourselves in the midst of the conversation and asking. And when you hear the moment, speaking up is probably the biggest and best first step. And I cannot stress enough, your voice may quiver, your heart may beat, but know that it is going to be more impactful than you know because of the privileges that a lot of us hold.
Absolutely. And just thank you for being here and holding the space and continuing to do the great work. They are an amazing follow on Instagram. Um, they're constantly and going live. So if you want to stick that in the chat. And thank you all for taking the time at the end of the year, at the end of the day, to be here and to be present. I'm hoping that we can have some more of these conversations and continue to go in depth, because it's definitely, the work is never done, and we certainly can't do it alone. So I thank you all so much. Kimberly, I made you host, so you are going to have to end the session. I meant to do co-host, but it's Zoom, it's the end of the day. It's just one of those things. So very good. Thank you. So thank you for tonight, and I hope to work with you again in the future.
Absolutely. Thank you again for the space you created this evening.
Thank you so much for all your work.